Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on an update from ControlCase on PCI DSS version 4.0. My name is Kishore Vaswani. I'm the founder and advising board member with ControlCase. And in a little bit, I'll introduce you to Pramod, who leads our certification business. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Our webinar is expected to run approximately 30 minutes. As we go through the webinar, if you have any problems hearing me or my colleague Pramod, please put it in the chat window and our moderators will be looking at that. Also, as we go through our webinar, please put any questions in the questions window and we will have time to take some of those questions before we end the webinar. Any of the questions we don't get to, we will make sure we get back to you after the webinar. A copy of these slides, as well as a recording, will be sent to everyone next week. We're very excited that you've decided to attend this webinar on this exciting topic, PCI DSS version 4.0. With that being said, as we get to the next slide, I'm going to introduce my colleague Pramod as well. Pramod, over to you.
Thank you, Kishore. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Pramod Deshmane. I'm SVP Certifications. I look after ControlCase certification delivery for North America, Latin America, and Europe. I'm also a PCI QSA for last 10 plus years, and we're working with ControlCase for last 13 years. Thanks.
Thank you, Pramod. Let me just walk you through the agenda at a very high level. I'll touch a little bit about ControlCase. My colleague Pramod will go through all the way from talking about the PCI DSS 4.0 timeline to goals to updates. He'll also talk about some of the options you have when we do PCI DSS 4.0, whether it's a standalone or consolidated. And then we'll get into next steps, and I'll talk about some of the next steps, as well as we will have some time for Q&A. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to first talk a little bit about ControlCase. At ControlCase, we focus on IT certifications and related continuous compliance services. Our methodology is to make sure that we act as partners and not as checklist auditors to our customers. Our aim is to make sure that we help you as a customer get compliant and certified in an accurate but streamlined manner. We try to make sure we maximize the efficiency of utilization of your resources so you can focus on your priorities as customers. You can see some of the statistics here where we have worked on many IT security certifications across regulations and really have a global footprint. The next slide will talk about two of our core principles. I touched on one of them, which is a partnership approach, where we are not a checklist auditor, but we really focus to make your cybersecurity posture better. We act as partners to you. The other important aspect that is important for us to streamline our operations is the use of technology. And so ControlCase Compliance Hub, which has been around for more than a decade, is used to automate and streamline the process of IT compliance, continuous compliance, and related IT security certification services. Today, we're going to talk about PCI DSS, but as the next slide will show, we have and focus on multiple regulations. So we're going to talk about PCI DSS today, but the next slide will show the different IT regulations that we as a ControlCase can focus on. This is a representative set of some of the more popular compliance regimes, accreditations, and certifications. Clearly, PCI DSS and the family of PCI DSS standards is a big part of what we do, but we also do other regulations out there, as you can see over here. Finally, before I turn over to my colleague Pramod to get into the nitty-gritty of PCI DSS 4.0, here's a high-level view of how our platform and our dashboard on ControlCase Compliance Hub looks. It helps customers get a viewpoint of all the different aspects of compliance, where they stand, as well as continuous compliance in a single dashboard. And it's used extensively in all the services we provide. My colleague Pramod will take over and get into the nitty-gritty of PCI DSS 4.0. Pramod, over to you.
Thank you, Kishore. Okay, so let's talk about PCI DSS version 4.0. As we all know, PCI DSS version 4.0 is out for a while, right? So let's start with one of the most important information about DSS 4.0, which is the implementation timelines. It is very important that all the organizations that maintain their annual PCI compliance have well understood these timelines. We all know that PCI DSS released PCI DSS 4.0 back in March 2022. It has been little over years since the standard is out. PCI DSS gave 2 years transition timelines for the newer version, which is with the older version 3.2.1 active for 2 years, which is until March 31st, 2024, upon which it will be retired. So in 2023, at this stage, we have around 11 months until version 3.2.1 is valid, right? In simple terms, until March 31st, 2024, both the versions are valid for PCI DSS assessment, and organization can perform their PCI assessment with either of the versions. Please note that the certification or the audit closure date which we are looking for has to be on or before March 31st, 2024, if you plan to do an assessment against version 3.2.1. So from April 1st, 2024, only version 4 will be active version for the assessments. Also, in other words, even if you start your PCI DSS assessment sometime in 2023, but if you are targeting to achieve your PCI compliance or to complete your audit after April 1st, 2024, you should plan for doing an assessment with version 4.0. The last and important timeline information is about the new requirements. So we have understood that from April 1st, 2024, all the assessments should be completed with version 4, but in addition, you get additional year, which is until March 31st, 2025, to comply with most of these new requirements. I'm using most of these. We have one slide where we'll talk about it. Most of the new requirements are best practice. There are a few which are to be met immediately. So all these requirements are identified as a best practice in the standard. In other words, when you do your PCI DSS assessment with 4.0, the identified best practice new requirements will not impact your PCI compliance until March 31st, 2025, and they'll be considered as not applicable. Moving on to the next topic, for the organizations that did not get an opportunity to go through the PCI DSS version 4 updates yet, we'll take a quick refresh, and we'll first start with the PCI 4.0 goals that PCI DSS considered while working on this version update. There are total 4 goals what they kept in front of them. The first goal is continue to meet the security needs of the payment industry. Cybersecurity threats are evolving, and hence the security practice must evolve to continue to meet the security needs of the payment industry as the threat changes. With this goal, PCI DSS updated existing requirements and also added new requirements. Following are the few examples of it. They made updates to the multi-factor authentication requirement. Then they also updated the password requirements in line with the current industry best practices, added new e-commerce or phishing standards to address the ongoing threats, updated requirements for sensitive authentication data or SAD, its secure handling, and added authenticated internal vulnerability scanning requirements for a greater insight into organizations' vulnerability landscape. We will dive into these examples in next sections. Before we dive into examples, let's talk about the second goal. So second goal was promote security as continuous process. Promoting security as continuous process is an ongoing security practice, which is very crucial to protect payment data. And with this goal, following the examples of the requirements which they have added. So the new requirements are around clearly assigned roles and responsibilities for personnel working on each requirements. They have also added guidance across requirements to help organizations better understand how to implement and maintain the security. They also added new reporting option to highlight areas of improvements and provide greater transparency for the report reviewers. Third goal is increase flexibility for organization using different methods to achieve security objectives. So providing more options and different validation methods to increase flexibility for organizations to achieve security objectives and support payment technology innovation. Few of the examples under these goals, they allowed the use of groups, shared and public accounts with exceptions. They introduced targeted risk analysis that empower organizations to determine the frequency of performing certain activities, and they introduce new customized approach method to validate PCI DSS requirements. That gives organizations another option to consider innovative methods to achieve their security objectives. Moving on to the next goal, which is the fourth and the final goal, enhance validation methods and procedures, improve validation methods and procedures with clear validation and reporting options to support transparency and granularity. So in this, the example is where they have increased the alignment between the information reported in the report on compliance or the ROC and self-assessment questionnaire and the information summarized in the attestation of compliance, right? So you will see the information is very much aligned between these different reporting formats. Now, with these 4 goals, which they kept in front of them while they developed the standards and all, right? So let's dive into that. What are those changes? So first, highlights of DSS 4 changes. So in total, there are several small updates they have done across the requirements with added clarification and guidance. And that's one of the best thing which they have done, that a lot of guidance have been added with best practices or good examples they have given for each requirement. They have also renumbered the requirements and testing procedures, and they have reorganized the requirements and all. So with this transition, many of the requirements they have carried forward with from version 3.1 to 4.0. But as they have also added new requirements and all, the requirements have been renumbered. So the same requirement, even though it was there with older version and it is now there with version 4, that requirement number may not remain the same, right? So that reorganization has been done. Then introduction of customized approach that provides greater flexibility. So the way you read the standard, right, when you open the DSS version 4.0 standard, the requirements which are written with the testing procedure and guidance, they're called as defined approach because they're clearly stated what is the requirement, what is the testing procedure, and the guidance for that, how to meet with it. But they have also added this customized approach objective, which is mainly for risk mature organizations who can think about innovative ways, newer technologies to meet the objective defined in that customized approach objective. Easy example of that, in DSS 4, you have a requirement for password length to be 12 characters, right? Which is a new requirement. It is a defined requirement. It says that your password should be 12 characters long. However, when you look for the customized approach objective, it is an objective. It says that a guest or a password or passphrase cannot be verified by an either online or offline brute force attack. That means your password cannot be compromised and verified with an online or offline brute force attack. Any technology or method with which you can meet that objective, you can go with that, right? That is how you can meet a customized approach objective. Most of the requirements have been provided with its own customized approach objective. So that's the addition. Then they have also introduced targeted risk analysis for various periodic or frequency-based requirements and the requirements that are met with customized approach. Now, you all remember with 3.2.1, requirement 12 required entities to work on their risk assessment, which is business level risk assessment. They have moved away from that, and only the requirements with frequency-based or requirement met with customized approach now require this targeted risk analysis. One of the example of that is your periodic anti-malware scans or malware scans, right? Entities now can determine the periodicity or a frequency of that scan based on their own risk assessment of their risk posed to their environment or not. So they can decide whether it should be few days versus a week, or whatever that based on their own risk assessment. That's an example of it. So that's a new addition. Altogether, there are 64 new or evolving requirements they have added, out of which 51 are future dated and 13 are to be made immediate when you go for DSS 4 assessment. Most of those 13s are related to roles and responsibilities. Now, with these highlights, let's dive into few of the examples of these requirements. Now, what you see on this slide are the examples, right? So first one, which you're saying for all PCI requirements, when I said that 13 of the immediate requirements, most of those fall under this category. That within each requirement now, you have documented roles and responsibilities for all the activities which you do within that requirement. You have to document them. Another example is 3.4.2, technical control to prevent copy and or relocation of PAN when accessed using remote access technology. After COVID, most of the organizations have found their way to work remotely. And if their business requires the employees to access the card data, right? With that keeping in mind, this new requirement ensures that technical control is implemented to ensure that when, for legitimate need, employees access the PAN data or account data remotely, they cannot copy, paste it on their local machines. Next is requirement 3511, which is for keyed cryptographic hashing for PAN. So hashes which are used to render the PAN unreadable are keyed cryptographic hashes of the entire PAN with the associated key management processes, which was not the case earlier with 3.1. So it's a new updated requirement. Next is 5.4.1, mechanisms to detect and protect personnel against phishing attacks. As you know, cyber criminals are increasingly turning toward the phishing attacks. So this new requirement is to address that threat. Next one, 6.4.2, implementation of automated technical solution for public-facing web applications to prevent web-based attacks. If you know 3.2.1, this requirement was there, but it was an optional requirement under requirement 6, right? Now it's one of the mandatory requirement when this requirement becomes effective in 2025. Next one, 6.4.3, manage all payment prescripts that are loaded and executed in consumer's browser. So for all the entities that have public-facing web applications, which are accessed by consumer to make the payment, this requirement is for the payment page on the web application that loads and executes scripts on the consumer browser. The entity needs to keep the inventory of all the scripts for the payment pages. They have to have a method to authorize every script and assure that integrity of the script is maintained. Next, requirement 8.3.6, updated password requirements. As I took an example of customized approach where I said minimum password length of 12 characters, that's a new requirement. Earlier with 3.1, it was minimum of 7 characters. Now we have minimum of 12 characters. Unless you have a technical issue, where minimum 8 characters can be considered. However, it has to be with technical limitation. Then requirement 8.4.2 and 8.5.1, which is multi-factor authentication for access to CDE and MFA system configuration. So use of MFA is not only requirement. However, earlier it was only required for the administrators for accessing the CDE. Now with 4.0, it is for any user, be it administrator or normal user. If they have access to CDE, they require multi-factor authentication system. And with 8.5.1, that MFA system for additional security controls of a configuration of MFA system also now are introduced now. Then requirement 10.4.1.1, automated mechanisms to review audit logs for the CDE and critical systems. Earlier with 3.2.1, automated and manual were the two options. With 4.0, you only have options as automated log review mechanisms. Next requirement 11.3.1.2, internal vulnerability scans via authenticated scannings. So as you know, internal scan is not a new requirement. However, earlier the scan was not required to be an authenticated scan. Now with version 4.0, it has to be an authenticated scan. Next example is 11.6.1, change and tamper detection mechanism for the payment pages. This new requirement is about implementing change and tamper detection mechanism to detect, alert, and respond to unauthorized changes on the payment pages, like changes to HTTP headers and contents of the payment page as they are received by the consumer browser. And the last example is requirement 12.3.1, 12.3.2, a target risk analysis for requirements that provides flexibility in terms of frequency-based requirements, the example which we took of anti-malware scan earlier, and all the requirements which you decide to meet with the customized approach, even that requires to go with its own risk assessment. So these are the few examples of DSS 4.0, and that will give an idea that what are the changes, right? And in few cases for an organization, there are major changes and all. Now, we'll talk about how ControlCase can help organization with PCI DSS 4.0 and what assessment options we currently provide. So the very first option is standalone PCI DSS version 4.0 assessment. With this, as we have developed our own assessment questionnaire for version 4, the assessment will be done as a standalone assessment using ControlCase Compliance Hub platform. And with that, we will have total of 100 or 105 questions based on the entity type to be assessed. Now, when I say 100 or 105, they are based on, for multi-tenant service provider, there are 5 extra questions to meet the Annexure A or Appendix A. Hence, the count will be 105. For all the entities, it will be 100 questions. So you will get assessed against the questionnaire set for version 4, and the deliverables will be, you can do this assessment as a standalone gap assessment or as a certification assessment, right? So based on the requirement, you can either get a gap assessment report or version 4 ROC, AOC, and the certification of compliance. So that was option 1. Moving on to option 2, it says consolidated assessment or consolidated assessment methodology. So mainly for the organizations who wants to save the effort of doing the 2 different assessments, the option will support them to do an assessment against certification assessment against older version, which is 3.1, and in tandem or in parallel, we can also do a gap assessment for version 4, and it will be done as part of the consolidated assessment effort. So with this, the ControlCase Compliance Hub will have a questionnaire which has the overlap captured for both the versions. With the overlap, the total questions will be 110 or 115. Like earlier, if entity is multi-tenant service provider, then there will be 115 questions. If not, there will be 110 questions. But these 110 or 115 questions will cover both the overlap of version 3.1 and version 4.0, and with an option to maintain the independent review of each version. We have a slide where we'll give a glimpse of how that questionnaire will be published. But when an entity performs the assessment with this option for both the versions in tandem, the deliverables will be that you get your certification done against 3.1, so the ROC, AOC, and the compliance of certification. And at the same time, you would get the version 4 gap assessment report, which will update you on where you stand with the DSS 4, the status of immediate controls and the readiness, status of future dated requirements and the readiness, and if you plan to use customized approach, whether that customized approach option is suitable based on the technology which you have, right? So we'll go through all those, the assessor working with you will go through all these options, and the gap assessment will give you information on all these parameters. So this is our consolidated assessment questionnaire view. So there are 3 examples which we have covered on this screen. If you were to do a standalone 3.1 assessment, then the initial scoping examples would show you the questions which only with the status of 3.1. If you do an assessment with combined or consolidated approach, then the network topic shows you a couple of examples where you can see you are given 2 options, one for 3.1 and second for version 4. And as you can notice, also in the question section, you have the question evidence request for version 4.0, right? So what happens over here, when you upload the evidence for these questions, which have overlap between both the versions, assessor would review the evidence for both the versions and would review and see whether the evidence should get accepted for both the versions, or it may happen that they accept it for 3.1 and fail it for version 4, right? So you can maintain the review and the statuses individually for both the versions, with the clear ask given in the question for both the versions. And last example under anti-malware section, as you know that there are new requirements added. This example shows only the requirements and the questions pertaining to these new requirements which are specific to version 4. So where you only see the status for version 4, you upload the evidence to be reviewed for version 4. So ControlCase can perform assessment with this consolidated assessment approach to the Compliance Hub platform. In total, what you are seeing over here is when we do an assessment with version 3.2.1, we have set of 96 questions. When we would do an assessment for version 4.0, we have 100 to 105 questionnaire. With the consolidated assessment approach, total 110 to 115 questions will be reviewed, and we estimate 25% of extra effort to get the version 4 completed when you do it in tandem or in parallel with 3.2.1. So that's a good effort saving, right, and gaining the efficiency comparison to when you do this assessment separately, especially when you do a standalone version 4 assessment, the effort will be much extra than when you do it with 3.2.1. This also shows you the status pie charts on the summary page on the Compliance Hub, where you can see with this example, an entity who has undergone the 3.2.1 certification assessment and 4.0 gap assessment towards the end, they're full green, which is where evidence have been QA'd and accepted for 3.2.1. But with version 4, many of the questions have accepted, but there are also, number of questions which are failed or written as part of the version 4 review. So you can have a real-time view and status of your assessment with respect to individual version. So with that, as we have dived into the version 4 updates, summary of changes, few requirement updates, and how ControlCase can assist you with the version 4 assessments and all, we'll talk about next steps, and I'll hand it over to Kishore for this section. Kishore?
Thanks, Pramod. That was extremely insightful, and I learned a lot on some of the new intricacies of PCI DSS version 4.0 and some of the options. As we take this webinar home, I just want to briefly touch on what you as an organization can do next, and then we'll dive right into Q&A right after that. If you're an organization that hasn't started your 2023 assessment, well, as Pramod mentioned, for 25% more effort, you can actually sign up with us to do a consolidated assessment, which will include obviously your PCI DSS 2023 3.2 report on compliance, but it'll also include the 4.0 gap assessment. So, if you haven't started yet, you can start with a consolidated assessment. The next slide is going to talk about if you have just started your PCI DSS 3.2.1 assessment and are still in the scoping phase. Very similar to the last option, we can add on the PCI DSS 4.0 gap assessment, just like the earlier option where I said, you'll get your certification for 3.2.1 and then the gap assessment for 4.0. As Pramod mentioned earlier, it'll be about 25% more effort. So it's certainly good use of time and effort and efficient. The next option is, obviously you can do a standalone 4.0 gap assessment. So irrespective of where you are with your current certification, or even if you're a first-time certification and you're getting into PCI DSS, would make sense to do a PCI DSS 4.0 gap assessment. There you would obviously get your gap assessment report from version 4.0. And then the final option is if you're ready and you think you're good to go for PCI DSS 4.0, and as Pramod mentioned earlier, if you think your first certification is going to go into, beyond the first or second quarter of next year, then the only option left is to do a PCI DSS 4.0 certification, because any new certifications starting, early to mid next year will be focused on PCI DSS 4.0. And so the last option here would be the PCI DSS 4.0 certifications. Next, we're going to get into Q&A. but I'll summarize the 4 options. If you could always do a consolidated 3.2.1 certification with a 4.0 gap assessment. You can do a standalone 4.0 gap assessment, or if you're ready, you can do a 4.0 certification. And so those are the various options. Just feel free to reach out to your ControlCase representative to talk through these options and be able to work through it. Thank you for listening to the webinar. Now we will have time for 4 or 5 questions. After we're done with the questions, we'll obviously answer any questions we have not been able to get to, and then we'll end this webinar with a few pieces of artifacts that I'll share with everybody. You all will get a copy of this recording next week. So I'll get into some questions. I'll take some of the questions and I'll have Pramod answer some of the questions. The first question really, I think, Pramod, for you would be, what are the benefits of doing the PCI DSS version 4 gap assessment now, when most of the requirements are still best practice until March of 2025?
Sure. First of all, this is a great question. I'm sure many organizations would have that same question. So at the beginning of the presentation, we reviewed the PCI implementation timelines, right? Where summarized 2 years after 4.0 release for moving, from older version to newer version, and additional 1 year, which is total 3 years from the release for complying with the new requirements. At this stage, as we're in May 2023, we have already passed more than 1 year of the timelines. We have less than a year for moving to version 4, and we have less than 2 years for complying against new requirements. And for many organizations, this remaining time may not be sufficient unless they start evaluating and plan for implementing these new requirements. We all have seen the transition from version 2 to version 3 with PCI, and the time it took, many organizations to work on the new requirements, the extension request and all. So in a nutshell, I'll give 2 main reasons for why organizations should look for version 4 gap assessment now without losing much time. And this is also because for many organizations, maintaining their annual PCI compliance is very vital, very important for their business. And any delays due to dealing with new version of the assessment will be a business risk, right? So the first, it is important that organizations and their PCI QSA or assessors are on the same page or have the same understanding about what is required to comply with these new requirements and what control evidence will satisfy or will be accepted for the assessment. Having this level of understanding before the start of actual 4.0 assessment or certification assessment will be very helpful. So that's reason 1. The reason 2, many of these new requirements, the examples which you took about MFA requirement expansion, new password length implementation of anti-phishing technology or automated technical solution for public facing web application, then authenticated VA scan, etc. They may require additional budget, additional resources to implement them. And working on that plan will require guidance from the assessor. It requires a management approval, a buy-in to go with this, right? So doing the gap assessment in 2023 will help organization address these 2 points, get ready for the implementation of new requirements in 2024 with the plan, and be ready for this requirement when they become effective in early 2025, which is less than 2 years. So those are the 2 main reasons why would I basically recommend that why organization should go for version 4 gap assessment now or this year, even though new requirements are best practice until March 2025. Kishore, back to you.
Great, thanks, Pramod. The next question is, what assessment options does ControlCase provide for PCI DSS version 4.0? I think we have touched on that a little bit. I can take that one. The assessment options are, number 1, a consolidated version 3.2.1 certification with a version 4.0 gap assessment. That's option 1. If you have recently started or are in the scoping phase, you could always do a standalone PCI DSS version 4.0 gap assessment. And if you're ready, you could do a PCI DSS version 4.0 certification. So really 3 options: consolidated, standalone PCI 4.0 gap assessment, and standalone PCI DSS 4.0 certification. So those are the three real options depending on where you are in your journey. The next question I let Pramod answer is how PCI DSS version 3.2.1 and 4.0 combined how is it performed? How is the combined assessment performed and delivered?
Sure, Kishore. Again, a good question. So as we discussed earlier, ControlCase has developed an assessment questionnaire for version 4.0 and also for the consolidated assessment option with the questionnaire for version 3.2.1 and 4.0 on the Compliance Hub platform. With the consolidated assessment option, the client environment will be assessed for both the versions in parallel or in tandem, and we will define the assessment milestone for each of the versions. As the client uploads the evidence, the assessor will review the evidence for both the versions and provide the feedback with the status changes separately for each version, as we saw on that Compliance Hub snippet. The Compliance Hub will provide an option to maintain independent review status for each of the PCI DSS version. With that, a question may get accepted for one version and fail for other. If required, ControlCase team can focus shifting the priorities from consolidated assessment to version 3.2.1 assessment to ensure that your annual compliance is met, and then continue with version 4 assessment as needed, the gap assessment as needed. In the end, organizations will get the ROC and AOC for version 3.1 and the gap report for version 4.0. So that's the overall end-to-end process, how it will be performed and what will be delivered.
That's great, Pramod. And just a follow-up quick question would be, what is the difference in effort between if someone does a standalone version 4.0 assessment versus the consolidated? What's really the effort difference do you estimate for a very average customer?
Okay, again, a very good question. We're getting good questions. So for this one, if entity decides to do, so with the two options, right? If entity decides to do a standalone version 4 gap assessment, we will need to review all 100 or 105 questions independently from the beginning. And the effort will be close to doing a full-fledged assessment, if not same, somewhat close to a certification assessment. However, when entity chooses to do the version 4 gap assessment in parallel with 3.2.1 or in tandem, we expect a great effort saving. So because there is a evidence overlap between both the versions, right? A lot of efficiency will be gained by avoiding redundant effort of doing the same questions review, right? All the evidence will be reviewed in parallel. So we estimate effort of like 25% extra effort over 3.2.1 assessment to complete the version 4 gap assessment. So in a total, doing the standalone version 4 assessment will be a big increase effort versus doing the consolidated assessment null. You'll only spend extra 25% over your 3.2.1 assessment and get the gap completed for version 4. So it's a very efficient way of doing the gap assessment for version 4.
Thank you, Pramod. And I mean, there were some more related questions on pricing. As Pramod mentioned, the amount of effort is 25 to 30% more if you do consolidated. Certainly, when we talk about pricing, that goes in line with increase in effort. But again, it's not multiples, it's more of 25 to 35% more pricing to do consolidated versus a standalone. This was all the time we had for questions. As we get to the final slide, let me just point a couple of artifacts and next steps. We have the PCI DSS 4.0 cheat sheet you can download. You can certainly schedule a PCI DSS certification discussion with us. Contact us at contact@controlcase.com. A copy of these slides and a recording for this webinar will also be sent next week. We thank you for attending this webinar on PCI DSS version 4.0. Please feel free to go to our website at www.controlcase.com for additional webinars that are recorded and we have done in the past. And then we will be uploading this webinar on our website as well. I thank you for your time to listen today to this webinar. I would like to thank Pramod for his time on sharing his useful insights on PCI DSS 4.0. Thank you, Pramod.
Thank you, Kishore. Thanks all.
And thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.